Well, welcome everybody on this beautiful day. Strangely enough, I was just thinking, it's for Christmas Humphreys, isn't it? It's our founder. And he died in this month in 1983. So we're getting on for the 40th anniversary of his death. And he was really a very remarkable man. And what brought it to mind was the weather, because he gave regular tea parties. And the extraordinary thing was that every tea party he gave, it was a blue sky just like this. And the neighbours used to kind of coordinate their calendars with when his tea parties were, because they knew there was going to be good weather. It was quite remarkable. I went to a few of them, and it was literally blazing sun whenever he had his party. So it's lovely to be on a day like this to be commemorating him. Well, he was a very remarkable man, strange, born in the last year of Queen Victoria, so he was sort of the last of the Victorians, but the same, he was preeminently an Edwardian, really, and had a very good career at the bar, but he's remembered by us, and we show our gratitude on this day to him because he founded the Buddhist Society in 1924, coming down from Cambridge. He actually got involved in Buddhism during the First World War when his elder brother was killed by the stray shell, really towards the end of the war, and that shook him up so much. Shook up that Edwardian world of certainty, and suddenly he was presented with the great doubts about religion and everything else, and admiring his elder. But that's when he actually came in touch, first of all, with the Buddha Dharma, and then studied it at Cambridge along with the law. And when he left, he founded the Buddhist Lodge of the Theosophical Society. Theosophical Society being at that time an international organization of people who were trying to look for some other kind of truth. And after the war, he bought the building with his own money, bought the lease on Eccleston Square, and on his death in 1983, he left his own house, which is now a Zen temple, now a Zen monastery, and we have a lot to be grateful to him. All the books that he published, his talks, his summer schools, everything that he did really brought to the attention of the British public and the worldwide public Buddhism to many people for the very first time. And I know that he would be really tickled, to have today the eighth Earl of Harewood, although I don't think David particularly is interested in that aspect of things, but he'd be absolutely delighted that the eighth Earl is here, and that the eighth Earl has put a Stooper in his garden, because that was the sort of thing that Humphreys really liked the idea of. He felt that Buddhism was something which fitted in with the Anglo-Saxon soul and the traditions of this country. He didn't feel there was any kind of conflict at all. So this would be a lovely thing for him. But I've had a look at David's book, A Hare-Marked Moon. This is what he'll be talking about. And I've read it. I got it yesterday, and I've read it right the way through. It's a lovely book. David tells me that he's never actually written a book before. It's his first book. But if it is his first book, he ought to do some more writing. Because it's really a lovely book. It's beautifully written, and one races through the pages. It's a real page turner. And you learn a lot. You learn a lot about Buddhism, learn a lot about the Buddha Dharma, you learn a lot about the symbolism behind Buddhism. But I'm not going to take up any more time. I'm just going to say two things. Big welcome to you, David. Thank you so much for coming. And I'm really looking forward to your talk. And the other thing is the Geraldine Connor Foundation. This is a foundation which is very close to David's heart, and it's the foundation brings the performing arts and other things to young people, disadvantaged people, and if you feel like putting your hands in your pockets and donating to that after this talk, as a little sign of gratitude, and Humphreys will be pleased with that too. Please do. You'll find it online. The middle way we'll actually be reviewing the book, so you'll find it in our journal. But I'm going to hand over to you now, David, with a big thank you. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry to keep you all from a sunny afternoon, but hopefully you'll think it's worthwhile. I'm going to attempt to share my screen. Let's see what happens here. Okay. 2004, I was standing in the reception area of the Gangte Palace Hotel in Paro, Bhutan, battling with the international telephone system, trying to call my wife Diane back in England. Watching me with some amusement were 4 Bhutanese monks. We were due to fly early the next morning to Delhi and then on to England a couple of days later. The monks were coming to build a stupa in the grounds of my family's home, Harewood House in Yorkshire. For all of us, it was a step into the unknown. None of the Bhutanese had ever been on an aeroplane before or travelled outside the Himalayan region. They'd never driven on a motorway or seen the ocean. 2 of them, including Lama Sonam, a master builder of stupas who was to supervise the project, spoke no English. I had no idea how they would react to a wholly unfamiliar environment, both physical and cultural. The language barrier, the weather, the food, the Yorkshire sense of humour. I finally got through to Diane and we discussed arrangements, when we would be flying, how we would get to Yorkshire from the airport, who would be there when we arrived, and so on. "How are you feeling?" she asked. I thought for a moment. I knew that having the opportunity to be involved in building a stupa was seen as something very special by Buddhists. But what kind of Buddhist was I? Was I a Buddhist at all? How was it actually going to work when the Bhutanese reached England? I had no idea. So it was a good question. How was I feeling? "David, are you still there?" Well, I said, "I think this is either the best or the stupidest thing I've ever done in my life." So, what is a stupa? The literal translation from the Sanskrit, stupa is translated as heap or pile. So in its most basic, you could describe a stupa as a pile of earth, a mound, some kind of burial mound, probably for a ruler or a dignitary, something that, of course, is found across many cultures, ancient and modern. Stupas have been built all across the Buddhist diaspora, not just in India, where Buddhism was born. And in each country, the design took on the character of the culture in which it was based. This is a Sri Lankan stupa. There's one in Burma. The Thai stupa, sorry, I've got those the wrong way around. The Thai one, this is the Burmese one. And in Japan, where they are known as pagodas, but essentially the same as the stupa. And in the Buddhist Himalayas, Tibet, Nepal, Bhutan, Sikkim, Ladakh, a very particular design, or set of 8 designs, has evolved, each design relating to places of importance in the Buddha's life, where he was born, where he achieved enlightenment, where he gave his first teaching, and so on. The Harewood Stupa is based on the Enlightenment Stupa, which is the large one in the middle of this set of 8. The basic shape of the Himalayan Stupa is quite simple. The base is a stylized cube made up of a series of stepped ledges. On top of that is a cowbell-shaped dome. Above that, a cone-shaped spire made up of 13 rings with a sheltering umbrella topped by a half moon and sun. I've heard them described as many things: as sculpture, as landmark, as place of worship, as place of pilgrimage, as mandala, as geomantic map pin, as reliquary shrine. I've heard them compared to the pyramids of ancient Egypt. Someone even told me very earnestly that stupas were often used as landing beacons by visiting spaceships, but this was in the 1970s. And there is some truth in all of these descriptions, except the one about the spaceship, of course. But the most complete and the most accurate in terms of Buddhist practice is that a stupa is both a symbolic representation of the enlightened mind of the Buddha and also a guide of how to achieve it for yourself. I've been fascinated by stupas ever since I first came into contact with Tibetan Buddhist culture in the 1970s. On that occasion, I went to Baldnath in the Kathmandu Valley in Nepal. The Great Stupa there is an impressive structure, whatever your religious beliefs or lack of them, as was pretty much the case with me at that time. It's over 130 feet high with a huge whitewashed dome that dominates the valley and towers over the circle of buildings that surround it. Buddha has been a significant place for both traders and pilgrims for many centuries, a key staging post between India, the home of Buddhism, and the high mountain plateau of Tibet. It's one of the most important places for Buddhists in the entire Himalayan region, a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and one of Nepal's leading tourist attractions, the image you see on all the magazine covers and travel brochures. But it was not its fame or historical significance that struck me most, however. It was how this massive structure was a natural focus, both for the Tibetans and Nepalis living in the traditional houses that encircled it, and for the monks from the monasteries in the fields beyond. Every day they would gather from before dawn to after dark and circumambulate the stupa. Some had come specifically, others were simply on their way somewhere, to the shops or on their way home. Some would make offerings of flowers or incense. Others would be deep in prayer, clicking the 108 beads on their malas as they recited their mantras. But many people simply walked around it, some slowly and thoughtfully, others with a more purposeful stride, always in a clockwise direction. It seemed such a simple and non-doctrinaire way of engaging with your faith. Matter of fact, relaxed, totally accessible, open to anyone. Although I knew very little about Buddhism at this point, I felt comfortable, at home even in Bauda, and found myself happily and only a little self-consciously joining the steady flow of people walking round, even venturing to spin the occasional prayer wheel. It was probably my first piece of Buddhist practice. Let's talk about Harewood for a moment. Harewood is a beautiful piece of English countryside, a green oasis nestled between the post-industrial energy of the conurbation of Leeds and the rugged romanticism of the Yorkshire Dales. It's where the Lascelles family, my family, have lived for more than 250 years. Harewood House was commissioned by Edwin Lascelles in the mid-18th century and paid for with money his father Henry had made in the West Indian sugar trade. This was a time when great fortunes were being made by many in Britain: the church, the royal family, banks and finance houses, artistic and educational establishments, as well as many individuals, all of it on the backs of the enslaved Africans who were forcibly shipped to the Caribbean and the Americas to work the plantations that produced luxury goods for the European market: sugar, rum, cotton, tobacco. Henry didn't live to see the building begin. A few years before the foundations were laid, he took his own life for reasons that are still not clear. But his son Edwin ploughed on. He employed the finest artists and craftsmen of the time for his ambitious new project. The architect was John Carr of York. The fashionable young Scottish designer Robert Adam was responsible for the interiors, working with his frequent collaborator Thomas Chippendale, born just up the road from Harewood in Otley. Joshua Reynolds painted the family portraits. Capability Brown designed the landscape. And much of Adam and Chippendale's work is still in the rooms they were originally made for, widely acknowledged as one of the finest country houses in England, with one of the best historic collections of furniture, paintings, and porcelain. Harewood has been through many changes through the generations that followed. And in 1985, the Harewood House Trust was established, an educational charitable trust that now looks after the house, its contents, and gardens for the public benefit. It gets more than 200,000 visitors a year. It is, as I've said, a beautiful place, somewhere quintessentially English, an embodiment of much of what is generally held to be good and admirable in our national heritage. That's one way of looking at it. But you could also say that Harewood represents privilege, inequality, patriarchy, a sense of entitlement. And it was built with money made as a direct consequence of the slave trade. My ancestors owned enslaved people. They were far from unique in that, but it's a fact nonetheless. And as the eldest son of the eldest son, sooner or later, I was going to be expected to take responsibility for it all. How did that feel? What was I going to do about it? How was I going to navigate those dark historic currents? And what does bringing over a group of monks from Bhutan to build a stupa have anything to do with any of it? I first visited Bhutan in 2002. It was somewhere I had always wanted to go ever since my first journeys in the Himalayas in the 1970s. It was an old friend, Graham Coleman, who suggested I visit to coincide with the conclusion of a project he'd been running, which was brokering an unlikely partnership between the Bhutanese government, Microsoft, and European aid agencies to create a computer font that would enable the Bhutanese to work on computers in their own language, Dzongkar. For anyone whose young imagination had been captured by the Himalayas, as mine undoubtedly had, Bhutan still had a wildly romantic allure. Overexcited travellers would describe it as a Shangri-La, the last remaining unspoiled place in the Himalayas. Hyperbole, of course. And I soon realised that Bhutan is as full of complications and contradictions as any other 21st century country, certainly no Shangri-La, but it had been many years since I'd been to the Himalayas, so a trip to Bhutan seemed like too good an opportunity to miss, a chance to reconnect with a part of the world that had always had a special place in my heart. In Bhutan, it was not hard to understand the extraordinarily direct, almost physical bond with our faith that pretty much all Bhutanese seem to share. It's there all around you, in the buildings that you visit, the streams that you cross, the hills that you climb, the very air that you breathe. There are caves with the imprint of the body of the great Lama Guru Rinpoche embedded in the rock. There's a natural spring at one monastery that runs warm in the winter and cool in the summer. There's a pond in a mountain stream where one of Bhutan's most revered lamas, Pema Lingpa, dived into the water holding a burning lamp. "If I am mad, I will drown," he cried. "But Guru Rinpoche tells me I will find religious treasure here." And some minutes later, he emerged, his lamp still alight, clutching a statue of the Buddha. Early one morning, I climbed with Pubdorji, a young English-speaking monk who was part of the Dzongkar computer project, up the steep track through the woods to the monastery at Pajading, white dots on the hillside high above Thimphu, which is Bhutan's capital city. Pubdorji showed me around the sprawl of buildings that made up the monastery, the monks' quarters, the kitchen block, retreat huts, shrine rooms dark with age, all very well looked after, with floors swept and altars properly tended. "Do you know what this is?" he asked me, pointing to an object in a finely wrought metal stand that stood on a shelf by one of the altars. I shook my head. "It's a dragon's egg," Pubdorji said, very matter of fact. "Would you like to hold it?" He lifted it down from the shelf, surprisingly heavy, about the size of an ostrich egg, slightly pitted and a dark yellowy brown in colour. I tapped it gently with a fingernail. It felt solid, not hollow as I'd expected. "Is there a baby dragon inside?" I joked feebly. "Have you never seen a dragon's egg before?" Pubdorji said. I did once hear an old Tibetan lady describe seeing a dragon in a very remote and uninhabited part of northern Tibet. She was on a pilgrimage, she said, and she'd just reached the top of a high pass. And there it was, coiled up like a huge snake asleep on the barren plain below. Disturbed by the presence of humans, it took to the air, and it was of such a size, she said, that by the time the last coil of its body had left the ground, its head was already above the clouds. One flap of its great wings, and it was gone. Stupas are everywhere in Bhutan, in monastery courtyards, in the middle of villages, at the top of mountain passes. They're very old ones, lopsided structures made out of roughly assembled stones, crudely whitewashed. They're brand new ones, cast out of concrete, sharp-edged and gleaming in the Himalayan sun. There were big ones and small ones in a host of architectural styles. Graham and I recalled conversations we'd had in the past about building a stupa at Harewood. Might there be someone here who we could persuade to come to England and do just that? Graham started to make inquiries, and quite quickly it became clear that all roads were leading to the same place. Sangay's dad, that's who you should talk to. Lama Sonam, he's your man. Sangay was the best friend of Dechen, Graham's Bhutanese soon-to-be wife, and by a wonderful coincidence, if you believe in such things, it seemed that Sangay's father was one of Bhutan's most eminent builders of stupas. We were told he'd already built more than 100 of them. So our trip out to see him in the little village of Hongso, about half an hour's drive from Thimphu, was an important moment. Lama Sonam came to greet us at the door of his house at the edge of the village. There was construction work going on by the house, and it was a moment before we realized what it was. Lama Sonam was building a stupa right outside his house, which meant we were going to be able to witness something that I'd never seen before, a stupa actually under construction. Lama Sonam is a small man in his 70s, wiry and vigorous, bow-legged, a weather-beaten face, eyes permanently narrowed against wind and sun, a wispy white beard and moustache, a shrewd and assessing smile. He was wearing a threadbare maroon tunic, dusty and stained, a woolen hat in the same colour, and no shoes. To my and Graham's surprise, he agreed surprisingly readily to the proposal, and we quite quickly found ourselves talking details, dates, possible composition of the building team, how big should the stupa be, and so on. This was all important because it quickly became clear that many of the components of the stupa would have to be made in Bhutan and then shipped to the UK. Watching Lama Sonam and his team at work on his stupa the next day, I began to learn more about how they were built. I learned that stupas are hollow structures built up in a series of chambers, each of which contain religious objects, offerings, and sometimes relics too. You can see Lama Sonam looking down into one of those chambers in this picture. The very first Buddhist stupas were built to contain the ashes and relics of the Buddha himself, of course. And it is what is inside a stupa that animates it, changes it from being an inert pile of stone into a living embodiment of the Buddha and his teachings. Someone described it to me like this: an empty stupa is a meaningless thing, like a bowl without water or a body without guts. Although the physical building work in England will be done by local builders, Lama Sonam and his team would oversee the whole process, making sure the dimensions were right, that the correct items went into every chamber, and that the appropriate pujas were performed at every stage of the process. It was agreed that Lama Sonam and his team should come to England the following spring, April 2004. It was going to be complicated, but we had a plan. The dream was looking like it might become a reality. It was a beautiful spring day when we arrived at Harewood. It had been a long journey, 2 flights, and then a 4-hour drive up the motorway from Heathrow. By the time we'd had lunch, I was ready for a jet-lagged snooze, but Lama Sonam had other ideas. He wanted to see the stupa site as soon as possible. We made our way there through the little white gate of the stone wall that surrounds the lakeside gardens at Harewood. The greenery was dense and overgrown, and we pushed our way past thickets of rhododendrons, laburnum, wisteria, and magnolia, all in full May blossom. It felt like entering a magic garden. And we arrived at the clearing where we put up some prayer flags to mark the site that we'd chosen a year or so before. Lama Sonam got his compass out. I knew that stupas were supposed to be to the west and to the south of the building to which it is relating. In this case, Harewood House, to which, of course, the whole capability brown landscape is oriented. That was what Lama Sonam was checking now. He gestured at the buildings visible a couple of 100 yards away through the trees. No, I tried to reassure him. They're just farm buildings, not Harewood House, not the big house. Lama Sonam peered at his compass again, tapping it vigorously with a grimy fingernail. Big house, which way? He asked. He clearly wasn't convinced. I realized there was only one way that we could see the house and the head of the lake at the same time. We'll have to go out in the boat, I said. The capability is a rather elegant electric boat decked out to give tourists a ride on the lake during the summer. It was moored nearby and ready to go. Boating isn't really a Bhutanese pastime, but they all seemed happy enough as they climbed on board, enjoying the novelty as the capabilities glided silently out onto the water. Lama Sonam cupped the compass in his left hand, rather officiously, I thought, but he was dead serious, concentrated. He was going to make sure everything was right. We stopped the boat in the middle of the lake. I pointed towards the house and then back towards where we'd just come from. A smile crept over Lama Sonam's face, and he nodded vigorously. No need for a compass now. Yes, it was fine. The stupa's positioning was as it should be. We could go ahead as planned. I breathed a sigh of relief. Next day, the 4 monks performed a puja to consecrate the site. There would be a similar performance at the completion of each stage of the building work. Each puja would be different depending on the occasion, but the structure of each one remained essentially the same. First, the monks would generate the motivation within themselves to act with the intention of seeking enlightenment, not just for their own sake, but for the benefit of others. They make offerings, in this case to the deities who look after the land and who might be disturbed by the building work that was about to begin. Later on, at the completion of each chamber, offerings would be made to the deity or deities residing within that chamber. Then the monks generate in their mind the awakened quality of the Buddhas, so that they themselves become, for the duration of the puja at least, an embodiment of those awakened qualities. The Buddhas thus invoked would be invited to enter into the physical form of the stupa, and the monks would extol the luminous qualities of the Buddhas that are now resident within it. And finally, any merit accumulated by the proper performance of the puja was dedicated to the welfare of all sentient beings. Everything was now ready for the building work to begin. Lama Sonam unrolled his diagram of the stupa, an elevation drawn on squared paper. This was to be the blueprint, or so I thought. Ian Copeland looked sceptical, not a good sign, as his involvement was crucial to the success of the project. Ian was the estate manager at Harewood, a builder by trade, and he was to be the link between the monks and the Yorkshire craftsmen and labourers who would undertake the construction work. I thought you said the proportions were important, Ian said. They are, I replied. Lama Sonam and the others nodded in agreement. But this drawing isn't accurate, Ian said. Look, the squares aren't even all the same size. And he was right. The grid, this one you can see here, was hand-drawn, and on closer examination, the stupa was more than a little lopsided. What I need is a scale drawing. You understand? Scale drawing, Ian said. Bob Georgie, official translator, looked concerned. Scale drawing, Ian repeated. You make the drawing, I'll build it. But if the drawing isn't accurate, then he made a dramatic mime of the building collapsing. The Bhutanese all laughed, a little nervously. We realized we could calculate the exact size of the stupa from the one component that we already had, the copper crescent moon and sun that you can see here at the very top of the stupa, and which I'd ended up carrying back from Bhutan in my suitcase. This was 4 units high on the drawing and measured 16 inches high in reality. That's an easy calculation. 1 unit equals 4 inches. We looked at the drawing again and counted the squares across the bottom, 32 of them. 32 times 4 inches equals 128 inches, which is 10 feet 8 inches. So we knew now that the base of the stupa was going to be 10 feet 8 inches wide. Now it was Lama Sonam's turn to look skeptical. He either didn't trust the mathematics or he didn't understand the calculation. We must get some proper graph paper, somebody said. I've got an idea, Ian said, just give me a minute, and he dashed out. The Bhutanese were looking apprehensive. Bob Georgie told me that Lama Sonam was worried in case we thought he'd made a mistake or didn't really know what he was doing or would not make a good stupa. I tried to be reassuring. Nobody has any doubt at all about Lama Sonam's knowledge of stupas and how to make them, I said. But to build one here in England is different from in Bhutan. All the knowledge is in his head, and we must have the information in a form that everybody here can understand too. That means on a piece of paper that people here can refer to when they're working. You will not have to do any of the physical work. The workmen here will do all that from your plans and designs. What you must do is supervise and make sure the work is right, perform the rituals and the pujas as well, of course. Ian reappeared with 2 lengths of timber about 12 feet long. This is the height of the square base of the stupa, he said, referring to Lama Sonam's drawing, and then marking a point some 8.5 feet up the timber. On this piece of wood, you mark each part of the base. Then we will have a scale model on paper and full-size measurements on here. A mutually acceptable working method began to evolve, both sides trying their best to accommodate the other. Ian was often frustrated by Lama Sonam's refusal to believe in mathematics and his rather approximate approach to measuring. The Bhutanese, in turn, were initially a little taken aback by Ian's forthright and remorselessly practical approach to every problem, but they made each other laugh and a genuine rapport was developing. Well, I'm trying to make them understand mathematics, Ian said, but I don't mind really if they don't get it, because at the moment they think I'm a genius. And before long, the Bhutanese had their own nickname for him. Ian, he is always action, Pudorji said. You must do like this, you must do like that. But he is a good man. So now we call him Lama Ian Action. The foundation of the stupa contains the first chamber, lined first with plywood, then with red cotton cloth attached to the walls and floor. It is the base of the stupa, representing samsara, the world we all live in, and so it is full of a whole range of worldly goods. The first thing that went into the chamber was a mandala made of a pair of cross Georges cut out of tin, painted and placed exactly in the center of the square, pointing in the 4 cardinal directions. Rice is then thrown onto it as an offering. Next, it was the turn of all the things that we surround ourselves with in our busy lives. First were the tools, mostly agricultural, as befits a country like Bhutan with a predominantly rural population. There was a model of a plough and yoke, a spade, a hammer, a sickle, a screwdriver, an axe, a pair of scissors, and a couple of modern Western additions, a mobile phone and a camera, a representative tool of my trade, filmmaking. Next were the musical instruments, the full monastic orchestra, a thigh-bone trumpet, a pair of long horns, a pair of galing, 2 pairs of cymbals, a large drum, small double-headed drum, and so on and so on. And after the musical instruments came the weapons. From Bhutan, a bow and arrow and a sword in a sheath. From the UK, a decommissioned handgun. Everyone had been encouraged to contribute something of their own to go into this chamber, and they brought a range of ornaments, a crystal, a brooch, a locket, a stone. Various other ornaments had been brought from Bhutan. My wife Diane contributed 2 of her own photographs and a poem by our friend Tom Clark, and 2 sprigs, one of English herbs and the other of oak, that most English of trees. Then the first batch of cha-chas was placed along the walls. Cha-chas are traditionally made of clay or plaster, mantras on little scrolls of paper baked into them. A couple of inches high, sometimes described as mini stupas, but shaped more like a beehive or a fairy cake, as someone pointed out. But they are important offerings used in large numbers in every chamber. 4,500 of them have been brought over from Bhutan. On top of the cha-chas went a host of other offerings, flat clay tablets with images of deities imprinted on them, paper victory banners, images of the 8 auspicious symbols, traditional Tibetan herbal medicines in jam jars, water, flowers, incense, wine, rice, and butter lamps, heat and light, food and drink, the essentials of life. And once all this was in place and the floor of the chamber almost completely covered, the final round of offerings was sprinkled over everything by hand. Dried flower petals, broken up incense sticks, small fragments of cloth, wheat, dried vegetables. These and all the other offerings in the first chamber were there in order to satisfy the earth deities, nagas, snake-like spirit creatures that live both in water and under the ground. There are a whole range of rituals for the propitiation of nagas in the Himalayas, because it is believed that they are the cause of many diseases. And of course, medical science confirms that there are many common waterborne diseases in the region, cholera, dysentery, hepatitis A, for example. After the concentration needed to make sure everything being put in the right place and in the right order, Lama Sonam and the other monks became more relaxed and took great pleasure in chucking the final offerings of plants and incense wildly into the air, covering each other and many of the bystanders in dust and making them cough. The filling of the first chamber had been completed to Lama Sonam's satisfaction. The cavity was then covered with red cloth, and next day the building team would take over and make a 2-inch concrete lid to seal the chamber and its contents forever. And then work could begin on the next chamber. The second chamber is dedicated to the deity Tara, the compassionate one, the Saviouress, the mother of all liberation, who holds in her hand the hair-marked moon. It is also the basis for the Dzogchen, the life tree, the stupa's physical and metaphorical spine that runs up its centre, through all the next chambers, its tip piercing the floor of the fifth and final chamber in the Bumpa, the dome of the stupa. This Dzogchen had come from Bhutan, and its selection and preparation were both precise and elaborate. First, the right tree had to be found, the right species, and from an auspicious place. Lama Sonam had chosen a mountain juniper for the wooded slopes above Wangdi in central Bhutan. Secondly, the tree should be felled the day after a new moon and by a man all of whose siblings are still alive. Thirdly, the trunk of the tree must be dead straight with no branches coming out of the section to be used. Finally, the eastern face of the tree should be clearly marked so that the Dzogchen should face in the same direction when positioned inside the stupa, and then the tree will be ready to be prepared. When I first saw the Dzogchen in Bhutan, it was simply a length of wood, dead straight, about 10 feet long and plain square. It was painted bright red and covered with hundreds of mantras delicately picked out in gold leaf. Arrived in England early one morning with the rest of the artifacts from Bhutan in a shipping container on the back of a gleaming brand new truck, and work on preparing it began almost immediately. First, the monks wrapped it head to toe in several layers of yellow muslin. 42 small paper packets were placed on the upper surface, the east face. The packets were then bound tightly to it with coloured thread. Each packet contained a holy relic of some sort, described in writing on the outside of each packet. Then 3 small bronze and copper statues of Buddha, Chenrezig and Guru Rinpoche, heavily swaddled in cotton wool and yellow cloth before being secured with more coloured thread. In this image, Lama Sonam is wrapping holy texts. They would also be lashed to the ever-expanding cylinder of the Dzogchen, which you can see lying on the chairs to the left of the picture. He continued to prepare the bundles of rolled up mantras, sticking the smaller ones end to end and packing them along with the larger rolls around the outside of the tree, between and around the 3 statues. They looked like sticks of cartoon dynamite tied to a ship's mast, lashed on as tightly as possible. Pubdorji pulled at the thread until his fingers blistered and bled. Then 4 lengths of coloured cloth were cut to the same length as the Dzogchen and wrapped around everything, relics, statues and mantras and holy texts, before being tied tight with more thread and stitched at either end. More and more fabric was added until the Dzogchen had become a cylinder of dense cloth, about a foot in diameter, several times its original weight, and with no hint of all the things underneath. It looked like a giant doner kebab wrapped in Christmas paper. And then finally, everything was sealed with a kind of oxblood coloured resin, made from insects found in the kind of juniper tree that the Dzogchen was made from. This is a substance that's very like lac, the substance used to make varnish, shellac and sealing wax, and sometimes used as a red dye. They come all the way from Bhutan in irregular, lumpy blocks, and now the monks were smashing these blocks up, pulverizing them, and boiling the powder in water to make a thick, sticky, toxic-looking paste. This was then painted all over the wrapped Dzogchen, forming a seal that protects the tree and everything attached to it from the elements. Lama Sonam told a story about a 600-year-old stupa he was once asked to repair and reconsecrate. When he broke through the resin sealing the Dzogchen, all the objects inside still looked brand new. The monks loaded the Dzogchen onto a trailer which trundled slowly across towards the stupa location, an incongruous sight on a Yorkshire country lane, but the kind of thing people at Harewood were starting to become accustomed to. Bulky and awkwardly balanced, it took 4 people to carry up the short distance from the trailer to the stupa itself. Once the Dzogchen was in position, everything properly done and the correct prayers recited, The stupa would no longer be an inert piece of masonry, but something alive, a sacred, living thing. This was a turning point. The statue of Tara had been placed, a mandala created, offerings put carefully in position, and all the prayers had been chanted. A sturdy crosspiece made of oak had been fitted securely across the middle of the chamber to take the dzogchen's weight. A special copper mandala made in Bhutan was placed centrally on the floor of the chamber, directly beneath where the dzogchen was going to go. The builders had constructed a scaffolding frame to which the dzogchen could be attached once it had been securely located on the crosspiece and hauled into an upright position. We lifted it by hand up onto the temporary platform round the second chamber, about 8 feet off the ground. This wasn't easy. It seemed to be getting heavier all the time. But now it was in position, still horizontal, but poised for the dorji to be at its end, to be the carved dorji at its end, to be aligned with the hollow in the center of the crosspiece. A delay. Lama Sonam wanted to be absolutely sure that the dzogchen was in the right orientation, that the east face of the tree, buried deep now under its layers, was still facing east. He checked the marks. The tree was turned a few degrees. Now everything was correctly aligned. We started to haul the dzogchen upright, hand over hand, Ian very much in control of the practicalities, Lama Sonam making sure there were no procedural slip-ups. And then it was vertical. Ian had his spirit level out and a large spanner to foot the 4 lengths of scaffolding that would hold the tree in place. It was done. People started to drift away. Lama Sonam and the monks performed their pujas. The builders covered the chamber in protective plastic sheeting. The second chamber was complete. Work carried on. One chamber after another was completed, though not without a hiccup or two. In the northwest corner of the 4th chamber was a little shrine to Tsogda, a deity of wealth and property specific to the area of eastern Bhutan that Lama Sonam was from. There were various offerings quite specific to Tsogda, quite different from any made so far. For this chamber, we need to make a 99 fruit offering, Lama Sonam told me. Only dried fruit will do. I was taken aback. 99 fruits, I said. I doubt if there are 99 different kinds of edible fruit in the world, let alone dried ones. How many would you find in the market in Bhutan? About 6 if you were lucky. But Lama Sonam was adamant. That's what it said in the text. That is what we needed to find. You have chosen to make a very difficult stupa, he said, chuckling. No, you have chosen to make a very difficult stupa, I replied, laughing too. So the search for 99 different kinds of dried fruit began. There were compromises to make. Nuts counted as fruit in this context, apparently, as did cucumber and sesame seeds, though tomatoes bizarrely did not. The first shopping expeditions to Sainsbury's, to a health food store in Harrogate, and to an Indian supermarket in Leeds yielded better results than I'd expected. A sweep of the spice shelf in my kitchen produced a few more. To my surprise, I found we'd got up to 47. Pretty impressive, I thought, but still less than halfway, still 52 short. I gave Lama Sonam the bad news, and he shook his head in disappointment. Then he reached into the folds of his tunic and produced a small plastic sachet containing some undefined grey substance. He held it up to me and gave it a little shake. 99 fruit powder, he said. I suppose this will have to do. It wasn't all work for the monks. We were determined that they should go to the seaside, a typical English summer holiday outing that will be a novelty for the Bhutanese. Their landlocked country is several hundred miles from the sea, and only one of them, Kesang, little more travel than the rest, had ever seen the ocean. There were heavy showers the morning we'd arranged our outing to Whitby and Robin Hood's Bay on the East Yorkshire coast. We looked at the sky and decided to postpone our departure by a couple of hours to see if it improved. It didn't. Let's go anyway, I said. The weather's often better on the coast. We set off. The further east we got, the worse the weather became. Lama Sonam was praying loudly at the back of the car. I didn't take it personally anymore because he did it on every journey, whoever was at the wheel. This next bit of road is very beautiful, I said, as we drove slowly up onto the North Yorkshire moors, stuck in a line of cars behind two caravans. Great views. The higher we climbed, the lower the clouds seemed to get. There was the occasional glimpse across the moors, fresh heather growing purple in the murk, but none of the magnificent long vistas I've been describing so enthusiastically. Do you get typhoons in England? Asked Kesan, whose only previous experience of the sea was in Hong Kong. Under the circumstances, it wasn't an unreasonable question. We parked at the car park at the top of the hill at Robin Hood's Bay and huddled under the tailgate as we assembled wet weather gear for the walk down to the seafront. The road down the hill is steep and winding, and today it felt more like a watershoot feature in an amusement park than a thoroughfare for traffic. Families in shorts and plastic ponchos huddled in the doorways of the souvenir shops and watched curiously as our unlikely group hurried by. Fish and chips in a nice cafe by the sea. Haddock and chips all round and some crisps to nibble while we were waiting. Lama Sonam fiddled with his crisp packet, unable to get a purchase on the slippery plastic. Suddenly, without any warning, he pulled a huge machete out from under his tunic and sliced off the top of the packet. Put it away, Lama, I hissed. You get us all arrested. And quick as a flash, and before anybody had noticed, he tucked it away again. We stared out of the window as the rain lashed down on the beach and told tales of sodden childhood summer holidays. We tried to explain that this was, in its way, a very typical English seaside experience. The fifth and final chamber was filled and blessed. The 13-ringed spire was built, and the copper toppings, all made in Bhutan and shipped over, the sun, crescent moon, and tear-shaped jewel, Lor Butok in Tibetan, literally the jewel tip, had all been put into place. Lama Sonam and the other monks performed a simple consecration ceremony. Another, more elaborate one, with another group of monks from Bhutan and many spectators from the UK and beyond, took place a year or so later. Everything had been done and done properly, just as Lama Sonam would have liked. So the stupa was built, but what had been done exactly? What impact would it have, if any, on Harewood? Stupas are said to harmonize their environment. In the Himalayas, they've often been built in regions that are prone to earthquakes, with the intention that they will calm the restless spirits of the earth, pin down and placate turbulent underground forces. In Tibetan, these are called dudel chotem, literally stupas that subjugate chaotic forces. Would the Harewood Stupa have a similar effect on its surroundings, subjugating the chaotic forces of Harewood's history and harmonizing the contradictions of its present? This seemed particularly relevant in the build-up to 2007, which was the bicentenary of the abolition of the slave trade in the British Empire. Harewood was, as I've already mentioned, built with money made through the sugar trade and therefore the slave trade that supported it. We had to take a position and not be part of what has been called the national amnesia on the subject. Diane and I discussed it night after night. We agreed that we had to stand up and be counted. Let's be damned for what we did, not for what we didn't do. There was nothing we could do to change the past. This wasn't Back to the Future, but we could be honest about what had happened. We could address the present and by so doing, inform the future. As the American poet Maya Angelou wrote, history, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. I found that what I'd learned about Buddhism while building the stupa was a guide and a support. Endeavour to see the things the way they really are. Use whatever knowledge and tools you have to remove obstacles and pacify negativity. Confront those chaotic forces. Pacify those restless spirits. We worked with a remarkable woman, this woman, Geraldine Connor, and staged her spectacular piece of music theatre, Carnival Messiah, in a massive big top in front of Harewood House. Geraldine's start point was Handel's great oratorio, Messiah, performed in her inspired transformation in a Caribbean carnival style. This is the image we use on the posters and program for the show. The cast was huge, the costumes enormous, the performances unforgettable. It was an exhilarating and transformative experience for everyone involved, and the basis of a strong and lasting friendship with Geraldine, which led to the creation of a foundation in her name following her untimely death, far too young, in 2011. But would you have had the courage or the clarity to do all this and take all this on if you hadn't built the stupa? Somebody asked me some years after the event. There's no simple answer to that. But for me, the way the timelines overlapped, for me at least, that means they will always be connected. A postscript. Harewood, May 2018. My father and stepmother Patricia's wishes were expressed very clearly in their wills. They both wanted to be cremated and their ashes mingled and before being divided into 3 parts. One part was to be scattered on the pitch at Elland Road, home of Leeds United. They'd both been honorary presidents of the club. A second part was to be scattered on the lake at Harewood, and the third was to be put into the family vault. So when Patricia died in May 2018, we set about fulfilling their wishes. We decided to tackle the third part of the request first, the family vault. This was trickier than it might sound. It had last been used when my grandmother died in 1965, 53 years earlier, and there were not many people still around who'd been at the funeral, so nobody was sure exactly where the vault was. We knew it was under Harewood Church, and we knew that the opening had been turfed over, but those were the only things we were at all confident about. Some research and a little more trial and error finally revealed the vault's location, under the southeast corner of the church, behind the final buttress before the church narrows to the chancel, the area around the altar. Digging began, and before long my son Ben and I were able to clamber down into the chamber that led to the vault. We entered a stone room with a vaulted ceiling, around 20 feet long and easily high and wide enough for 2 6-foot men to stand side by side. It was very neat and tidy, no damp or cobwebs, no hint of mould. And all my ancestors were in there. From Edwin Lascelles himself, the builder of Harewood House, who died in January 1795, to my grandmother, interred here in 1965. The weather had turned the day we put the urn containing the ashes into the vault. We'd had more than a week of glorious sunshine, but now it was raining and gloomy. Somehow it seemed appropriate. A small group of us huddled under umbrellas as the rain spattered the gravestones and made a puddle at the bottom of the ladder down to the vault. We'd all agreed that the 3 sons, me, my stepbrother Michael and my half-brother Mark, should be the only ones there when we put the urn into its final resting place. We stood there for a few minutes, quiet and somber, and I read 4 lines from the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The end of collecting is dispersal. The end of building is disintegration. The end of meeting is parting. The end of life is death. It was done. The door to the vault was locked and the stone covering replaced. The rain continued, not heavy, but persistent. In a week or 2, the slab with my father's and Patricia's names and dates engraved on it will be put into place and the vault sealed until it is time for the next one to go in, which will probably be me. We decided to do the scattering of the ashes on the lake the following day. This is something that is notoriously prone to black comedy, especially if the wind changes, so I suggested an alternative. Why don't we scatter the ashes from the bridge at the head of the lake, right by the Stooper, I proposed. From there, they'll wash down over the waterfall and into the stream, just as good as the middle of the lake. You remember this is what the monks did with the sandandala they made for the consecration of the Stooper. It was a perfect May morning, cool but sunny, as the family gathered and carried the second urn, wrapped in a prayer scarf, through the Himalayan garden to the Stooper, collecting some flower offerings along the way. The Stooper itself was already strewn with offerings of candles, incense and flowers. We walked the urn 3 times round before processing the short distance up to the bridge. I unscrewed the lid and we all took it in turns, oldest to youngest, 3 generations, to pour the ashes down into the water. Some drifted like smoke over the lip of the waterfall. Some caught the flow of the water and hurried over the edge. Some lingered in the shallows under the bridge, waiting to be washed slowly away over the next few hours. In the days that followed, my thoughts kept on returning to the disposal of the ashes, those 2 consecutive days, and how different they were. In some ways, they seem to sum up many of the things that I felt, that I still feel about Harewood. The vault was heavy with the weight of history, solid, immovable, buried deep, hidden away. Those makers of Harewood are very well sealed into that vault. Their bones are in wooden coffins. The coffins are cemented in behind a stone slab. The whole vault is locked behind a thick wooden door. The door is covered by more very substantial stone slabs. The stone slabs are covered in turf. Unless you know where to look, it isn't easy to find. Access to the final resting place of my ancestors is for the chosen few only, while their memory lingers on in the building, Harewood House, that they built and furnished and lived in. But the vault is an immaculately crafted place, elegant in its way, understated, built to last. Harewood, a microcosm, perhaps. A house and a landscape with a fascinating, often troubled, but also often surprising history. It's somewhere that often feels to me to have perhaps the wrong kind of reverence for the past, something dead in there too, perhaps, unless you can find a way of breathing new life into it, which many of its owners have tried to do, of course, though it must be said that some have tried harder than others. And that's what pouring the ashes from the bridge at the head of the lake right next to the stupa felt like, a breath of new life. There was a younger and fresher energy at work here, an energy that treated the past with respect, but looked at it with a degree of positive skepticism, an energy that is fueled primarily by the need to engage with today and tomorrow. The original stupas were built to house the ashes of someone who had just died. So was the family vault, but their function could not be more different. For Buddhists, death is seen as a beginning as well as an end, as a liberation, as a moment when the possibility of enlightenment is as strong as it is ever likely to be in your lifetime, stronger perhaps, when the concept of beginnings and endings is no longer relevant, just another turning of the wheel, where you can achieve a better rebirth or just possibly escape from the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth altogether. The dark, silent vault is very much a final resting place, somewhere to contemplate the reality, the inevitability of death. The sunlit, flower-strewn stupa was somewhere you could celebrate its infinite potential. So, thank you all for listening. Stop share. Here we all again.
David, thank you. That was a really lovely talk. I really found it quite moving in parts, and I must say the stupa itself looks absolutely beautiful. How does it look actually in real life? It looks to me completely at home where it is.
There was quite a lot of debate at that when the monks first came over. They assumed initially that it would be whitewashed, like so many are in the Himalayas. But I was equally keen that it should be made of local stone, that it should look as if it was part of the landscape. And they took a little bit of persuading about that. Yeah, I mean, they're fantastic craftsmen in Bhutan, but they're not stonemasons. They're great wood carvers and great weavers and so on and so forth. But a lot of the stupas there are quite roughly made and then whitewashed, which sort of covers over the faults. So I was trying to persuade them that the quality of stonemasonry they get here was something that you just wouldn't find in Bhutan. The clincher was I took them to York Minster, which is possibly the greatest example of stonemasons' work, well, certainly in this country, possibly in the world, actually. And they couldn't believe what they saw there. They couldn't believe. Lama Sonam would stand by the pillars, literally sort of stroking the stone with his hand. He couldn't believe that had been, that it was done that way. And that convinced him that natural stone was the way it should be made, not whitewashed. Mm. And all the stone is local. I mean, it's all either found on the estate, or some of the things that had to be cut very precisely we had done from a quarry up in the Pennines, but all local stone.
Yeah, well, that's very good, because that actually answers the next question. What was the stupa made of? So it was all made from local stone, from Yorkshire stone.
All made from local stone. I don't know how to get the picture of the stupa back to without losing everybody, but as I say, a combination of found stone from the estate, from walls or barns or whatever that had fallen down, and cut stone from a quarry in the Pennines.
And there's a question here: how long, David, were the monks with you at Harewood, and how long?
About May, June, July, about 4 months. A bit stop and start. The shipment that came over from Bhutan was very late arriving, but about 4 months. Yeah, they arrived in May and left at the end of August, early September. So it was a long process. And then another group of monks came over later, the following year, for a full-blooded consecration with several hundred people there. But they were only there for a couple of weeks.
There's a question here: did you go back have you been back to Bhutan after the building of the stupa?
Most recently, I went back in 2016, which is I've been in Nepal, which is where I wrote the bulk of the book. I was trying to find out if any of the Bhutanese involved where they were. And in Lama Sonam's case, was he still alive? He was well up his 70s when he was when he came to England. But he was. So I saw him again then, and we were able to say goodbye. Not in good health anymore. His health was never very good, actually. Not helped by the fact that he was a bit of a hypochondriac, but he wasn't. He was well into his 70s and not very healthy. So he died probably about 6 months after I saw him, something like that. But I was very glad to be able to say a proper goodbye. It was quite moving, actually. I mean, I said to him, we've been on a great adventure together. I mean, he speaks no English, but he obviously understood exactly what I was saying. And we said our final farewells.
There's something here from Sarah Ewens. Thank you very much for a very beautiful talk. Could you say a little bit about how your local community have responded to the stupa?
Very positively. I mean, there was a lot of curiosity when we started off doing it, and people not really understand. Well, the understanding that it was a building project, they didn't really understand what the difference was. Yeah, the idea of sealing precious objects inside, the idea that it would have no meaning unless it had those precious objects in, and so on. That was quite alien. But a lot of people got involved with the actual building process, and since then, I mean, Harewood and its gardens gets around 200,000 visitors a year. Not this last year for obvious reasons, but on a normal year, around 200,000. And a lot of them wander around from the house, round the lake, and past the stupa. Now, obviously, the vast majority of them are not Buddhists and know very little about Buddhism. But mostly, people's reactions are very kind of instinctive. We have a little sign up explaining what it is. And now we've got 3 people, I now hope, from Jamyang Buddhist Center in Leeds, who are sitting in for a day during the week, talking to people about it, encouraging them to walk around it, explaining a bit about what it is. But people's instincts about it are very just that. It calms people down. It slows them down. And many people walk around. You get kids climbing on it, which of course they shouldn't, but it's all done in not done in any malicious way. So the reaction has been very positive.
When there's a question here, which is an interesting one, because when we go to Bhutan, It's my reaction to Bhutan was one of I was really impressed by the country and all the things that you mentioned at the beginning of your talk. Was the question here, what did the Bhutanese make of the UK and Yorkshire?
um, very different reactions across the four of them, actually. I mean, Lama Sanam was very focused on the building project, and of the other, there were four in the team. There's Lama Sanam, his long-time assistant, again spoke no English. We took them around a bit, and they thought the Yorkshire was very beautiful. They couldn't believe how green everything was. Obviously, they were here in the height of the summer, and there were days they just said that, oh, this is like paradise. So this is just the whole country is one beautiful green garden. Well, Georgie was much the most social, and he got out about. I even on one occasion, the two sporting occasions, I took him to football once to Elland Road, and we went together to do something which I'd never been before, which was to a polo match in Tadcaster, at which everybody was so surprised to see him that they asked him to present the cup at the end of the event. So they saw a fair bit of it. As I say, we went to the seaside, we went to York, numerous shopping expeditions up into the Pennines to the quarry where the cut stone was from. And again, showing them how all that works. You know, how stone is cut with like a laser knife, which is extraordinary to watch, and they'd never seen anything like it. Lama Sanam said he wanted one to take home, but I thought that was a bit dangerous.
And of course, the most vital question, of course, is when does the book come out?
Well, the book isn't out yet officially. The official release date is May the 13th. So you're getting a very much a preview. You can pre-order it from Amazon, or even better, from your local independent bookshop. I don't know where you're all based, but I know that there are places that are taking pre-orders. I know that the Grove bookshop in Ilkley, for example, quite close to here, a couple of people have said they pre-ordered their copies from there. So yeah, buy early and buy often. That's what I recommend.
Well, can I just say something about the book, because I was impressed on looking at how beautifully made it was. And not only that, I thought the quality, the sharpness of the photographs was unusually good.
Yeah.
A lot of the time you do see color photographs, but they're not. The sharpness and the definition is not good.
Yeah.
And these photographs, I mean, they're all of them absolutely beautiful. I think as a commemorative piece and of your adventures and so on, it's a wonderful record. And certainly it's going to go into my library.
Well, the publishers are Unbound. They're crowdfunding publishers. So the funding for it was all I raised through crowdfunding. But one of the reasons I really liked them was that just what you're saying. All the books of theirs that I've seen are really beautifully made. Well designed, good quality of paper, good photographic reproduction, all those things. So no, they've been a joy to work with. Actually, I must say I've enjoyed it.
Well, thank you. There was another question here. How did the monks get on with English food in the 4 months?
Yeah. Well, they did all their own catering, so they were mostly eating the kind of standard Himalayan rice, dal, sabji, eating that a lot of the time. Lots of expeditions to the supermarket. I quite enjoyed that. That was those were always quite entertaining. Just before they left, we decided we'd have a barbecue for them, just expecting a few people would turn up. And it turned out that every single person that they'd met, pretty much while they were here, wanted to come. There were about 50 people. Yeah, they managed okay. They managed okay with it, but as I say, mostly cooking for themselves and having their own routine.
Thank you. And there's a question here, and I suppose there's a lot of sort of ramifications to it, but it's a very simple question. That is, did the building of the stupa transform you, and did it deepen your understanding of Buddhism? But I could say also, did it you're talking about the slave trade and so on. Did you feel that it had, the connection between the past and the karmic kind of consequences of the building and the whole thing? Perhaps you could make some comments on that.
Yeah, no, very much so. No, it changed me enormously. I mean, what I've been talking about today is really only the first half of the book. The second half of the book, I read a couple of bits at the end, which come towards the end of the book. The second half is kind of me doing my research after the event a little bit. I travelled a lot in India, Nepal, Tibet too, going to on the pilgrimage route around the 8 original stupa sites, talking about different stupas, telling me where they come from, what their history is, something of their meaning, what the stories are behind the making of some of them, and so on. And so, yeah, it's very much changed my life and given me a perspective, if you like, on what we were doing here and what I was doing with my life that is different than it was before. So yeah, a big change. As I touched on in a bit when I'm talking about 2007, people have asked me that question, and it's difficult to make an exact correlation. And there was not, I didn't have any kind of road to Damascus type moment, but there's no doubt that just being in contact with and learning more about Buddhist philosophy and its attitudes to how you should live your life and how you should treat other people has affected that enormously.
I'm sure, and it probably kind of radiates something, doesn't it, from just its proportions and so on. It's a very satisfying thing to look at. Something.
Yeah, I mean, that's what started. I mean, being in the presence of stupas is, to me, is a very powerful thing. I mean, as I say, the first one I ever became sort of aware of as a young man was at Mountnath, which is one of the great stupas anywhere. But the smaller, more modest ones that have a very powerful presence as well. And the little stupas you get sometimes in monasteries with the ashes of somebody associated with that monastery, those have a real power to them too. And I do find them very powerful objects, and that works on many levels. Part of it is, if you like, it's very satisfying sculptural form. That's part of it. But it's, but of course, it's what is in it and what it means. You can't, it's form and content, if you like, are absolutely intertwined. And they're beautiful things, beautiful bits of sculpture, architecture, whatever you want to call it. But obviously, they are, I came to realize, and hopefully my talk illustrates, they are much, much more than that.
They are, because, I mean, without getting too sort of esoteric, because 18th century architecture is all sort of Fibonacci, isn't it? And golden section and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And this follows a different proportion altogether, doesn't it?
Well, essentially, it's the 3 basic geometric building blocks: the cube, the sphere, and the tetrahedron, the cone. That's essentially, if you draw those one on top of each other, you've got a very crude drawing of a stupa. So it starts from the very kind of basics of geometry and of the shapes that make up everything, and then it adds layer upon layer of meaning on that. What the shapes are, the fact that each shape represents a different element, different color, and the different Buddhas associated with each color and so on and so forth. But you start from I talk about this in more detail in the book. You start from the absolute basics of geometry and sort of build from there.
Yes, that's a very nice little bit of the book where you start with the dot and you move into 1 dimension, then 2 dimensions, and
That's
3
right.
dimensions.
That's right.
The whole thing is kind of brought together in a sort of unity. Well, David, that was a really lovely talk. And can I just ask you, is Harewood House open at the moment? Are you open for business?
Well, I mean, we've had the COVID nightmares everybody has. The house is still not open, but the grounds and gardens are open and have been now since, I can't remember the date, but anyway, when the last sort of lockdown step was reached, we're now open every day, gardens and grounds only, and the house will open in mid-June. But till then, I just say, I don't know where any of you live, but if any of you in this part of the world, please do come and visit. It's a beautiful place, plenty to see, as well as the Stooper. Lovely walks, lovely gardens, lovely food. Yeah, do come.
It all looks so beautifully looked after and cared for, and I think the stupa it's just perfection in that surrounding. It's extraordinary that it fits into that sort of that landscape, that 18th century idyll, isn't it? It just fits perfectly.
Well, I mean, it's you do find, I mean, no stupas, but you do find follies of one sort in the grounds of country houses, don't you? Of like
Mm,
pagodas or tea houses or
mm.
Greek, mock Greek temples and so on. I had to explain to people quite often when the stupa was being built that this was not a folly, that I might be a fool, but it was not a folly. It was the thing that was being made properly in exactly the way it would have been made as if it was in Nepal or Tibet or Bhutan or whatever. It's done absolutely authentically.
Yeah, it's lovely. Anyway, I think that brings us to the end of our questions. So David, can I thank you very much indeed for a lovely talk, and can I also remind you of you'll see on the chat bar at the very top, you'll see the details of the Geraldine Conner Foundation with the website, and the book can now be got from Amazon. And David, thank you so much for a wonderful talk, and I think it's just was the perfect talk to give for Christmas Humphreys Memorial Day. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I've really enjoyed doing it. And yeah, as I say, hopefully some of you will be able to read the book and enjoy that too. So.
Yeah, we think you should write some more books, actually. It is so enjoyable to read. Thank you. Thank you, David.
Good. Thank you all very much. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.